Welcome to the Proactive Security Podcast with Mike Hodges and Brine Hamilton. This podcast is dedicated to discussing violence prevention in healthcare. We want to inform, equip, and empower healthcare security leaders to prevent violence before it happens. And now, here's your hosts, Mike and Brine.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike.
And I'm Brine.
And this is episode 9 of the Proactive Security Podcast, and we have a very special guest today. We are talking with Fred Burton. How you doing, Fred?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you guys for having me on.
We're very excited. Just so our listeners know, Fred Burton, you're the Executive Director of the Ontic Center for Protective Intelligence, and that is your current role, but you've got a pretty extensive career and pedigree in the security world, and specifically within the protective intelligence arena. So I'd love for you to just kind of give us a quick overview of your accomplishments in the security realm and introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, I look at it this way. I am either viewed as the father or the grandfather to some degree of this topic at times. Depends on who you ask. But back in the 80s, Mike and Brine, I was a special agent with the State Department, and I realized that we were not getting in front of threats. We were not doing what we needed to do to threat hunt and to actually look for threatening actors or assassins or bombers, whatever, pick your poison, before they acted. So I was part of the original team that put together the first Protective Intelligence Division for the State Department. And as a part of that, we were very heavy into the consolidation of intelligence-related information into at least one office, which was a start, since we were so dysfunctional in those days in many ways. And then we also created a very unique counter-surveillance component to that, to where we were supporting protective details, outside of your usual traditional perimeter of protecting the likes of a Princess Diana or a Yasser Arafat. And for some reason, I was able to talk our director into letting us kind of beta test that program. And it turned out to be a success, which, looking back now, I guess 35, 40 years, is still very much in existence. And I'm proud of the fact that that has progressed. And in the late 90s, I still don't know how this happened, but a headhunter had learned of this program that we had put together, and I've gotten way too much credit for this than I deserve. But he said, I know that there's a company that wants security, but they really don't want to see it, but they know they need it. And I said, well, heck, that's easy, but I've got a pretty good job as it is. I don't know if I want to leave the government. So to make a long story short, I transitioned this model to the private sector, and I believe, or I've been told, that I was the first to do so, and then actually created the first protective intelligence analyst position, which was another agent that was part of my process with me that I brought to that. And from there, I would like to think that, at least as an industry, as our sector, Mike and Brine, that we are much better off. At least those programs that are looking at this holistically and proactively to attempt, assess, and mitigate threats. And I still see a lot of companies struggle with how to do that today while I run our Center for Protective Intelligence. So we have a tremendous amount of papers and podcasts and thought leadership discussions at our center. And I would certainly encourage your listeners to visit, and whatever I could do to help them with that process, I certainly would love to do.
That's great. I also will mention, before we dive deeper into the concept of protective intelligence, I would also mention you're a fairly prolific author of some fascinating books. You want to share some of that with our listeners?
Well, I thank you for that, Mike. That's very kind of you to say that. I draw a distinction between, I've been blessed to be published. I don't necessarily feel that I'm a great author. Those are the Hemingways of the world. I think there's a big difference, but I've managed to put together my memoir, which is Ghost, and then my follow-up book to that was Chasing Shadows, which is a story about a political assassination in my neighborhood when I was a kid, and my efforts to try to identify that assassin many years later. Then my third book is called Under Fire, which is the story of Benghazi, from the eyes of the State Department and the protection of that facility, which in many ways has a very heavy protective intelligence angle to that for your listeners. And then my last published book is called Beirut Rules, which is a story of the kidnapping and murder of the CIA station chief, Bill Buckley, in Lebanon. It was a case that I had actually worked on when I was in Washington. My unit was the Counterterrorism Division and the Protective Intelligence Division. So we wore two hats early on in those days. And so I worked a lot on the hostage problem in Lebanon and the kidnapping of Americans. And, quite frankly, there's a lot of protective intelligence lessons learned into those abductions and those kidnappings, which caused us to rethink. And let me say this, I'd like to say unlearn protection and rethink how better to protect people and facilities. And I think that's what we struggle with today in an industry at times, that you do really need to unlearn certain aspects and rethink how you approach certain problem sets.
I think that's a great way to look at it. One of the things that's interesting to me, and certainly coming from a healthcare perspective, like Brine and I are accustomed to, and that focus on protection. I liked what you said earlier. It was a company that was looking to have security and knew they needed to have security, but didn't want to see it. I like that thought process. And then the other side of that, you mentioned earlier this concept of hunting threats and trying to gain that intelligence piece from the front end. In my experience, people are really comfortable investing resources in tangible assets. And to some degree, intelligence can be an intangible asset if you don't know what you're looking for. And so I guess one of the questions I would have is, when you talk about hunting threats, especially from an organizational perspective, whether it be private company or healthcare company, hospital, et cetera, what are you really trying to look for there? What are you analyzing or going after from a hunting standpoint?
Well, first, in my conversations over the years with several corporations, countless corporations and high net worth individuals and billionaires, the first question I always ask is, well, help me understand why you think you need security. And then look at it from a baseline perspective from that aspect. And it's really fascinating when you ask that question, Mike and Brine, because people struggle to answer that. Well, we know we need it, but why do you think you need it? Has there been an incident that caused you to reach out to somebody like me? Or help me understand your mindset as to why you would want to do this to yourself. Why would you think you need an executive protection team? Is it just because everybody else has one? Or is it because it's really been threat driven, or you've had a tripwire event? So from my aspect, when you start looking at threat hunting from a philosophical perspective, you really have to define first, what is it that you're going to be looking for, and what is the purpose of that? And how are you going to collate, assess, and disseminate that information? Meaning, and this is something that the intelligence community has struggled with forever, in that you can collect all the hay that you want, but it's really the needles that you have to try to find. And today, we are all inundated with information to the point that it's very hard to make sense of that. So there really has to be some very thoughtful assessment internally as to why you are looking and what you are looking for, and then put together that baseline threat assessment that should be holistic in general, used as a living document, revisited periodically. Quarterly is best, but I'm a realist and know that we're usually shorthanded and we don't have a lot of resources to do this in our space. So semi-annually is good, but even if you do that once a year, that's fine too, because as our threat landscape changes, you have to have that baseline in order to look for the anomalies. And I'm a big proponent today of the fact that when I started with 3x5 index cards and typewriters, you can no longer do that anymore. You have to have technology assist you in this endeavor, or your intelligence gaps are big enough that you can just drive a truck through.
One of the things that I've been very interested in, certainly the national conversation has been very focused on active shooter events or active threat events, and that seems to be the big security incident that a lot of people are very focused on. In the healthcare environment, we don't see, note that I'm knocking on whatever wood I can find here. We don't see large scale indiscriminate shootings or active assailant events. What we see is primarily targeted violence, domestic violence situations that spin out of control and end up manifesting in an active killer on campus going after an employee who's involved in that crisis or something to that effect. When it comes to analyzing targeted violence scenarios, when you're made aware of a threat, what are some recommendations you might give to security leaders in the industry to say, these are some good ways to start interrogating that threat to help you understand what you're looking at?
Yeah, it's a real good question, Mike. I think first you have to make sure that you've collected that data, which at times gets misreported, misrouted, and that the initial report is collected and triaged by professionals in our space, like you and Brine have programs to be able to do that. And that holistically then, that individual or that threat actor, you can rapidly collate as much information as you can about that person in what I believe is the future, in a single pane of glass, to where you don't have to swivel between different data sets. And you want to be able to work up as much information as you rapidly can on that threat actor, to include criminal and civil. And then you also want to make sure that whatever database that you're using or platform is also accessible to other stakeholders inside your healthcare system that might have a dog in that fight, so to speak, such as HR, legal, facilities, health and safety, the front office, depending upon what kind of incident it can be. But what I see more and more, Mike, is that compliance and audit trails are critical, meaning just from a thought leadership perspective, that if you cannot document what you did when and what actions you took, that can clearly come back to haunt you civilly and your company. And I see a lot of us in this space not realizing that, thinking, oh, well, I've had a local guard force take a report. But then what actions did you take? And help me follow that audit trail to understand exactly what you did or didn't do, because that will be picked apart at some point in time. And I know, just from listening to your podcast, by the way, which is very good, that this section, this vertical, has a lot of violence in this space, and that probably it doesn't have the spotlight shown onto it as much as it needs to be, because I think most people would find that frightening. There's certain psychological places I think we all go to in our day-to-day world that you two live in that we all like to think are safe spaces. Schools, hospitals. Not so sure about the workplace anymore because of Boulder, Indy, pick your poison lately. So I think part of that challenge is also from a psychological and a perception issue. So it's a very difficult environment to be operating in, especially when it's open to the public.
That's interesting. You talk about, processing that information from the point of entry, right? And I appreciate your use of the word triage. We like that word in the healthcare space. But
I'm an old EMT.
Well, there you go. See, you're right at home with us. We like that. But one of the things that's interesting to me is the process beyond that initial point of intake. And so, most organizations, and I am using broad terms here, but most organizations who have a security force or a guard force have a means or a mechanism to take in information via incident reporting from that frontline staff. But that follow-on interrogation process is, I think, what's most organizations struggle with, and certainly not only the interrogation of that threat actor, which you're speaking of, but also the data and analytics associated with that. One of my kind of key interests, and I'd be curious as to hear your thoughts on it, is, once you've identified an individual actor, digging into that individual's background, whether it's civil or criminal or other avenues, to try to understand the level of threat you're associated with. And my key interest is social media. There's so many avenues in the social media arena to interrogate potential threats. How does somebody get their arms wrapped around that kind of information overload?
Technology. The only way you can get your hands around that, Mike, is technology solutions that to include the dark web, which it's not the brass ring that everybody's looking for, because as we've seen, with the recent events, especially after January 6th at the U.S. Capitol, that a lot of these organized groups and members recognize that that's all being looked and scraped and evaluated by law enforcement or security services of a range of different nations today. So, but having said that, social media is something that not only affects that threat actor, but also steps over into brand impact to certain sectors, ramifications on social justice issues, depending upon what stance your organization, company, or CEO might be taking on a range of different issues today, in what I call our current days of rage, which is something certainly our nation has seen before, looking back between 68 and 72. But the tempo today is to the point where these threats are becoming increasingly unmanageable. Therefore, when you get into, again, that oversight and compliance and audit trail perspective, Mike and Brine, that becomes critical as a manager, because things can certainly get lost in the cracks, or you're putting out another brush fire today and you don't have time to follow up what you did yesterday. So that's where technology can be your friend to make sure that you do have all those T's crossed and I's dotted, to make sure that you are compliant. And that cannot be done unless you've set up proper process and procedures to get you to where that needs to be. And I know how difficult this job is at times, in that there's not a lot of time for paperwork or follow-up. We all know that. We've all been there. Well, I'll get to that tomorrow. And then tomorrow becomes a new problem and you don't. Plus, you're dealing in an environment today where these threat actors do come back to haunt you. And unless you have a management system in place to keep track of these individuals, how do you know who has risen their ugly head today that you should have a much better handle on? And so I see a lot of that still in very difficult places in corporate America today, where legacy systems, don't exist to be able to do that. And folks are still dealing with Excel spreadsheets and sticky notes. And, that's fine if it works for you, but I guarantee you that'll be the first thing that's attacked. God forbid, if you have an incident on your facility, and a defense attorney, asks you to show you your audit trail.
The sticky notes don't work. That's troubling.
Well, they do for kind of like reminders, Mike, but I would not encourage those sticky notes to be your case management file system.
That's fair. That's fair.
No, but it's true though. I still talk to people every day who are using spreadsheets and sticky notes really for their audit trail. So it's not outside of the realm of what's actually happening. You're bang on.
For sure. I think one of the things, I have this conversation over and over, and so I'd be interested in your thoughts, Fred. Is oftentimes I talk about threat management, and so a threat materializes and say, well, what if scenarios? This is what if would we do with this particular type of threat? And a lot of times what I hear from corporate leaders, especially in the healthcare realm, is, well, we would call the police. Well, okay, that's a great answer. What else? And so I'd be curious on your thoughts on individual organizational responsibility when it comes to threat management.
Yeah, that's a darn good question, and one that certainly resonates today. If I got asked that question, which I just have been, my answer would be turn on your TV set today and look at the response problems, the scope, the breadth, the overwhelmed law enforcement entity serving any city in Canada or the United States today. At the end of the day, the cops are overwhelmed with just answering their service calls or 911 calls, and a lot of them have had their investigative units cut back to the point that there's very little follow-up, if any. And as a former cop and as a former agent, I understand all of that. But I also know that at the end of the day, I'm a realist and realize that there is probably no law enforcement entity in America that's aggressively looking for threats against your business. Don't get me wrong. If they stumble upon one, if somebody says something about your company or CEO, they're going to notify you. But the point is that nobody is threat hunting for you in the local, state, or national space. To some degree in the cyber realm, yes. Yes. But by the time you're notified, it's usually too late. So this is where I see, again, the relearning of protection, meaning in many ways, we are on our own. When I say we in corporate America, because it's incumbent upon us to recognize that public safety is overwhelmed today, and that we have a duty of care to our own people and facilities and executives and customers that might be coming in and out, or patients, that it's up to us to do what we can do and recognize that, yes, it's okay to leverage law enforcement associations and contacts and information, but at the end of the day, they've got their hands full past the breaking point. And I wrote a article several years ago now, Mike, before our current Days of Rage, where for Police One, and I discussed that would the presence of a uniform police car now elevate your threat posture? Maybe so, depending upon what city you're operating in. Meaning, in my day, if a police presence was there, the perception was it's there to deter crime. Today, does that elevate your threat profile to where it's going to draw these threat actors to you and actually elevate and increase your threat profile? It's an interesting equation. There hasn't been enough academic studies or research around that, but it's one that I would certainly think about depending upon where I'm operating today.
That's a fascinating point. And I think, to some degree, we talk about it in your basic level training for, use of force as a frontline officer. We talk about officer presence being an initial application of force because we know that's a double-edged sword. Sometimes you walk into a room with a uniformed officer and it calms everything down. Sometimes you walk into a room with a uniform on and it raises that escalation to new heights. And I think that's interesting from an organizational posture to consider, groups that are targeting law enforcement in our present environment, because they're certainly out there. Do those groups now target your organization if they see that association?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one from a protective intelligence aspect, I think is worthy of further discussion and research. And it's something that I know if I was a corporate security manager today at a facility, I would, and depending upon your geography and the state of play and your local dynamics and the local politics and the localized violence directed towards whatever, it would be something that would factor into my threat assessment of my facility, meaning you might be better off without that uniform presence. And I know many companies around the world hire a lot of off-duty cops for security related work, which I'm not bemoaning that in the least if it serves their needs. But does that uniform elevate your threat posture? It's an interesting question, one that's certainly worthy of further discussion and further research, and very thought provoking.
Very much so. We're coming up on our time, and I'd like to kind of ask just, one of the things that you've kind of talked about in general as we've gone through our discussion today is that shift from, reactive kind of firefighter mentality and security to that more proactive and preventative, protective, intelligence-driven mentality. And so, I'm a big proponent of that in the healthcare space, and would love to see a stronger push towards a protective intelligence style posture in the way that we approach security and relearn or rethink how we go about it. I'd love just kind of in as we start to wrap up here, any kind of thoughts you have or advice you have for some of our listeners in protecting healthcare and hospital facilities. What are some practical steps they can take to move towards that more proactive posture?
Well, I think one, I know from our own research at our Center for Protective Intelligence that threats are rising and becoming unmanageable. And the data there exists. And to that point, I think it behooves those in the healthcare space to look at their protection programs from a holistic perspective. And if they haven't conducted a baseline threat assessment in light of everything that's transpiring across the world today, taking in everything from mental health to COVID to social justice issues, they need to include the position that your company or hospital or CEOs or high profile doctors are engaged in, to include what they're putting out on social media at times that might draw unwanted or a whole range of different, threats upon you, to understand that holistically. So first and foremost, that is a daunting challenge today, to just try to comprehensively assess the threat landscape. If you don't have the internal capabilities to do that, I would certainly try to budget off some dollars to at least outsource that so you get a good baseline. And an independent assessment at times can help because then, at least internally, it's not viewed as something that perhaps is self-serving, which none of us in this space today. I've been around this business long enough to know that all of us are professionals to the point that, we would not elevate that threat posture, but it can help to have, at times some independent eyes on whatever kind of threat evaluation that you're making, or at least benchmark that across. Which is something that I really applaud you guys for trying to do too with your podcast and so forth, is that I don't think we take advantage enough of our collective wisdom in this space. Meaning, if you are that healthcare sector and there's others that are in your same shoes, to be able to call upon to help. And much like we're chatting today on your podcast, all of us in this business, I have never yet called a security professional in any capacity at any company where I've not got a return call. And I think that we are the kind of people in this business that want to help. And more importantly, we want to help each other. So I would take advantage of those networks and take advantage of that subject matter expertise and leverage those assets that we have in the industry in general to understand that. The other thing that I think is problematic in your space, Mike, and I know you and Brine have probably covered this, is that, you know, when you look at just physicians and medical facilities that are off campus that still might be affiliated with the home office, and just the volume of that across geography is something that is daunting. So I think that's also important as you start thinking about this from an enterprise risk perspective, meaning do you really understand your risk landscape if you have a parent organization that might have subsidiaries of 15 to 20 that could be engaged in all kinds of different things? And what is the scope of those things? And that threat that might be unique to that geography or to that city. For example, with operations in Minneapolis today, or Portland, or whatever cities under siege tomorrow, to understand that holistically. I vividly recall early on, I won't mention the company, but doing some threat assessment work for a company that really did not understand their footprint, geography, or supply chain. And I think that you're also in that kind of industry today too, that you're in such a issue that's so important today. One could argue that it's a national security ramification, healthcare, vaccines, COVID. So with that brings, a whole range of different potential threats from a strategic perspective that I would bet that many in your C-suite don't think about or understand.
That's it. And that's a great point too, that you mentioned just with regards to the off-campus facilities as well, because that's been just in my personal conversations, that's been a huge talking point. Now, one thing, Fred, and this is just for my own edification, it's just listening to everything that you're saying. What is something that you wish you knew 35 years ago that you know today? And I'm just asking because just looking at your body of work and the knowledge that you have, I'm just curious as to what's something that you think would have been really helpful to know 35 years ago.
Ask for help if you need it. Don't try to go it alone. Take advantage of sage counterparts. Listen more, talk less. I think listening is a lost art. And try to be more forgiving for yourself, understanding that in many ways you're always going to be in this predicament of reaction, but try to understand that you can't do everything, and at the end of the day, ask for help if you need it.
That's great advice, and advice that I think all of us have probably learned at least some part of that probably much later than we should have. So thank you for engaging that.
Yeah, and thank you for everything. We've really appreciated this conversation, and I hope it definitely sparks some additional conversations with the people that listen to our podcast. I know you mentioned it earlier, but I'll mention it again. There's a tremendous body of work, white papers and others, information at the Center for Protective Intelligence there, and I hope that our listeners get a chance to take a look at some of that and kind of deepen their knowledge base. And to your point, reach out for sage wisdom from those who have been there before and have the lessons learned from the wars they fought previously. So definitely appreciate the time.
I thank you guys for having me on. I know you've got a very difficult job, and whatever I can do to help going forward. And I'm sincere when I say that. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And until next time, everyone, stay proactive.